This is Karen with newclevelandradio.net, and it is time for Avoid the Maze. We all know what that maze is. It's daily living. You wake up in the morning, you have all these plans for the day, and by the time your feet touch the floor, some of those plans actually change in lightning speed. But you know what? That's what life is all about. It's going with the flow and preparing for um, the unexpected. My guest today is Ryan Ray Harbuck, and I met her through podmatch.com. And in her bio, she says the following: My teenage years challenged me with not only a paralyzing car accident, but with an alcoholic mother as well. I had to learn quickly. I had to grow up fast, finding a lot of power in my own vulnerabilities. I became a teacher and a swim coach. I found my way to India for experimental stem cell treatment. I navigated torrid relationships until I finally met the love of my life. Marrying only 3 months after meeting, I became a mom. So many of us want to believe that our childhood, our teenage years were perfect. I don't think anybody has that perfect life, but you had some additional challenges in yours. So give us an idea, Ryan. You're a teenager and you have this accident. Now what?
Yeah, I think so. Leading up to it, I would say I was a pretty typical kid, pretty typical teenager. I went to a really big high school. There was, I think, 3,500 kids in the high school. And I was relatively shy and introverted. I had a good subset of friends, but I really just, I would much rather be sort of a wallflower. I was an athlete. I was a swimmer. I had grown up swimming. It was definitely a part of my identity. And so leading up to my accident, I wouldn't say that there was really anything extraordinary or notable about my existence at that point. And so on some level, my car accident really was one of the best things that had happened to me. And I truly believe that to this day, because it gave me a chance to really gain a new perspective on what life is and really grow responsibility and maturity for my own life. And so I think that, kind of looking back on it, those traumatic teenage years were really, really profound and a really big stepping stone for myself. When my accident happened, it happened the night of a high school dance. And so a group of myself and our friends, we were in a car driving to go bowling after the dance. And nobody really knows what exactly happened, but the car ended up crossing the grass median of the highway, hitting oncoming traffic, and everybody was injured. There were two fatalities. I wouldn't necessarily say that I had it any worse than anybody else from that night. But I do know I don't have any memory of that night. I don't have any memory of the dance or leading up to it. Your brain does this really wonderful thing of guarding you from traumatic experiences. And so I'm certain that that has helped me in my progress over the years, because it's really easy for me to talk about my accident and also separate sort of my life before and then my life after, my life now. But from what I do know, I am really lucky to be alive. When the paramedics found me, I wasn't breathing. I had lost a lot of blood. My neck was twisted. They really didn't know the extent of all of my injuries. And so the paramedics just kind of plopped me in an ambulance and hoped that I made it to the hospital. And clearly I did. I sustained a spinal cord injury, which left me paralyzed from about the rib cage down. I have no movement or feeling. And that was a pretty instantaneous event. But beyond that, I sustained a lot of road rash because I was ejected from the vehicle onto the highway. I broke both my legs, both my arms, collapsed my lungs. I was in pretty bad shape, but I really don't have much of a memory until about a week later. And it's always really bizarre to me because I do remember kind of waking up in the hospital and knowing already everything that had happened, but my little teenage brain was kind of like, you have to ask somebody what happened, because that's what you do, that's what they do in the movies. And so I remember, asking the doctors and my parents what had happened, but I already knew everything that had happened. And I knew, I knew that there was somebody in our car that passed, and I knew that that I couldn't feel my legs, and going back to just not having that memory of it, I think that that really sort of helped me navigate what to do next,
Sure.
because it really did sort of separate. Okay, well, I had this life and I don't really have that life anymore. I also think that being a teenager really served me well, because I was truly a kid, and my biggest worries of the day were, how can I hang out with my friends, and what do I have to do to get to the point where I can go to the movies and the mall, and that's really where I kind of sat.
Sure.
And it wasn't. I think that kids really don't have the ability to dwell on the past. I really don't. It's not in their nature, and it's not something um, that really they can process. And so I just went from, okay, well, I'm in the hospital and I have these injuries. Okay, well, but how do I get to the point where I can go play with my friends again? And so I think that from very early on, I didn't get caught up in what had happened. I didn't have a lot of woe is me time or depression moments where I really wondered why this had happened to me or why I deserved this. It wasn't really that way.
Okay.
I also think that being an athlete really helped that as well, because it kind of gave me the mindset of like, if I practice this skill of getting dressed or pushing a wheelchair, then I will get better at it.
Interesting. Because uh, I too, when it was my senior year summer, so going into my senior year, um, I had been working and I had a friend fix me up with one of the guys from work. And uh, I don't even remember where we were supposed to be going, but he was driving down this very hilly gravel road. And he said to me, "Do you like roller coasters?" And I said, "No." Um, and next thing I know, we're speeding down this road, and there was a car coming towards us, and we hit it not quite head on. Um, and the only thing I remember uh, from it was noticing I had some blood on my head.
Mm.
I jumped out of the car, which I'm told saved my life because the engine actually fell into the front seat.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
Um, and I mean, and that wasn't even on my mind when I jumped out. When I jumped out, the only thing that was on my mind, my mother's going to be mad at me because I'm bloody and dirty. Okay.
Right.
Um, so I think you're right. As younger people, the weirdest things come to our mind. We don't stop and think about, am I hurt? Am I dying? Is anybody else hurt? You know, uh, and the other thing I remember the whole way to the hospital saying to the paramedic, "My mother's going to kill me." And the paramedic kept saying, "No, she's going to be happy to see you," uh, which she was. But
Mhm.
going back to your accident, um, you said it took about a week before you actually started, like, maybe communicating with people to say, "Hey, what happened? How am I doing? When can I get up and do my favorite things?" But you also mentioned, in your bio about your mom. So did you have the family support there? Because that may have been difficult for her.
Right. Well, and so leading up to that, my mother had been drinking prior to that, but I didn't know. I knew there was something that wasn't right about her. And our relationship was a little bit strained at that point because I didn't quite understand what was going on. Um, I thought maybe she was taking sleeping pills because she was acting different at nighttime. Um, and so really going into that, I didn't really know, but I will say that, our family dynamic, I think at that point had really been um, sort of twisted and um, strained. I have a younger sister, she's 3 years younger. And I would say that nobody in our family at that point was really good at communicating in terms of how we're feeling, what's going on. I didn't feel like we were really bound together as a family. We didn't really stand up for each other. And not because any one of us didn't love one another, it was just, um, we were just strained from each other.
Right.
Um and so kind of going into my accident, I'm sure that that really really caused a lot for my mom, and I think that that maybe ultimately what um made it to the point where we all did know figure out what was happening, because it did get worse. But I think that more than anything, that lack of communication in our family, that was the piece that was the most harmful for each of us.
Right.
And we didn't have each other. I don't remember a moment of ever, having being able to talk to my parents and say, like, this really stinks, or I'm so sorry that this happened for all of us. And because after my accident, it was really clear very early on that the people around me suffered almost more than I did, because when something happens to you yourself, you sort of have control over it. You have control over what you do about it and how you feel about it. And so there is that piece. But when something happens to somebody that you love, it's a very very hard situation, because you don't have that control. You can't control how that person feels or
Right.
what person is able to do from that. And so that's probably one of the worst feelings in the world, is just watching somebody else go through something. And so I recognized that pretty early on with my family and even my friend base. And once I was well enough to figure out how to use a wheelchair and leave the hospital, those few couple months, it really gave me a taste of, this is my new life, and it's my job sort of to let everybody know that I'm okay and that I'm just me, and they don't have to treat me differently. They don't have to feel sorry for me. And so there was a lot of um, introspection and sort of reflecting on how I perceive myself and how others should perceive me very early on. Probably, I was 16 still, and I was going through a lot of um, really big emotions that I didn't necessarily know how to process, because a lot of kids don't really get the opportunity.
Absolutely. And, you know, whatever were the family dynamics prior to that, every family has their own culture. And there's some that, we're just not going to talk about certain things, and it just becomes a known. And then there are others, like my family, that you talked about everything. Even if you knew it was going to get you in trouble, you
Yep.
talked about it because you better get in trouble now and get it over with
Sure.
than wait. Um, and so for those listening, we can't, we can't have a judgment on what is right or wrong. But what I'm finding very interesting, Ryan, is that you were mature enough to know that, hey, this is who I am right now. This is what I need. And you were able to sort of, let people know that this is okay, you know. Um, Whereas I think, and maybe I'm wrong, and I'm not a psychologist, but I would think that the average 16-year-old probably is, oh, woe is me. you know, um, I'm not gonna be able to go to the next dance, and wear that fancy dress and wear high heels and everything else because I'm in a wheelchair. Um, and truthfully, I think that's the attitude I would have taken, at least initially. Um, so there was something that was fed to you somewhere along the line from your mom and dad and the people around you to know that you were going to be okay, however it turned out.
Yeah. Well, and you never really know until you're given that circumstance. I wouldn't consider myself extraordinary or special in any sort of way. I think that I learned that, in order to continue to live my life the way that I wanted to, I had to accept a lot of things, and I had to, perhaps try a little bit harder than I would have had to otherwise or would have wanted to otherwise. But I also learned that it was really rewarding. And so I think that, somebody else plopped into my life may have chosen the exact same path and may have been able to learn those things on their own. I think I'd also learned that it wasn't going to serve me well to be upset about it or to dwell on it. And it didn't do anything for
Right.
me or anyone else.
Well, I did learn that lesson early on because anytime you would say in our house that you couldn't do something, my parents said, use the word try. I
Mhm.
will try, or I tried. And then identify, you know, what you accomplished. And my parents were forever saying, see, you did take the first step. And I
Mhm.
would look at them and go, well, yeah, but there were 10 steps. There's 9 more to go. And the answer always was, when you're ready, you'll take those steps. And if
Mm.
you're not, then you've achieved what you want to achieve. Um, and some of us, don't get to learn that lesson. And we don't have the support for it. But you you mentioned also that you believe that anything is possible. So when you were in the wheelchair, did you say to yourself, I know that I'm going to get up and walk across the room because if anything's possible, that would be a possibility.
That's very true. I think that I sort of took that notion of, if anything's possible, I should be able to walk out of here kind of thing. I think I put that away, put it in a pocket somewhere. As I have kind of talked about the things that serve me and the things that don't, it doesn't serve me to sit and try to say that walking is going to make my life better. And I think that that was also something I learned pretty early on too, that it wasn't that piece that made my life full. And if anything, having a challenge in front of me on a daily basis um, gave my life some enrichment and some extra meaning to it. And so I think that it sounds really quirky, but perhaps the fact that that impossibility of me walking gave me the possibility for everything else.
Well, that in itself is a great message for all of us because, I think we all have these dreams about ourselves, and sometimes we um, let it take us down a dark hole because either we don't know exactly how to make it happen, or maybe it's not going to happen in that manner. It's going to show up in a different light. And if you're not open to accepting the difference, um, then you're going to feel like you failed. And the reality of it is there's a lot of winning moments in life if we
And
allow them.
being in a wheelchair, that's definitely something that has taught me, because I have learned that the things that I want to accomplish, I can accomplish regardless if I'm in a chair or not. However, the steps that it takes to get there, or the energy that it takes to get there, might be quite different than what I imagine, what I want it to be. But the journey is just as rewarding, if not more so.
So you talked about the fact that um, you've become a teacher, a
Mhm.
swim coach. So I'm sure you're using a lot of those coaching elements um, in helping yourself as well as others. Was that always on your radar that that's what you wanted to be when you grew up?
It's so funny. And because I never wanted to be a teacher, I never wanted to be in the classroom. Um, I, in college, studied biology in the hopes that I was going to be a doctor or physician's assistant, something of that regard. But as soon as I had my accident, I began coaching swimming. And I did so, I think, because the adults in my life at that time recognized, well, how is she going to participate in this thing that she's been, been such a part of her? And so they gave me a coaching job, um, like fresh out of the hospital. And, that was one of the biggest blessings of my whole life because it gave me the opportunity to be involved in the sport. I still swam as well, but obviously not in the way that I had before. But that coaching piece, kind of sparked something inside of me that gave me the ability to reach other people, younger people, and be able to share the lessons I had learned or the things that I struggled with. And so that was something that was a really clear path for me in many different ways. And that led me to teaching and other things. And the thing that I've always loved the most about all of my professions is the ability to just connect with younger people and share my stories and um, the challenges that I've had, the adventures that I've had, and and I think that that's ultimately what led me to writing a book as well.
So tell us a little bit about the book because, um, one of the things I have found in the last year when I started Avoid the Maze, um, most of my uh, guests have been coaches of some sort. And typically, when a person thinks of a coach, at least the way I used to, it was the swimming coach, the baseball coach, the football coach. Didn't think about people coaching us through life.
Mhm.
Usually, when you have a medical issue or emotional or mental, you go to a doctor because that's what Western medicine does. Like I'm going to go to the doctor, I'm going to get a handful of pills, and I'm going to be better in the morning. And the reality of it is that I'm not saying that doesn't help, but a lot of it helps with our mental attitude. And obviously, you have a very positive mental attitude. Um, so, did you find that um, when you started coaching, and I don't mean, just in swimming, but in teaching as well, that you could see yourself getting stronger and healthier by the moment?
Yeah, exactly. And I think that one of the things that writing my book sort of highlighted for me was because it all began with different stories that I had shared for years and years with athletes and students and peers. And and there were all of these little tiny themes and lessons within them. And one of the strongest themes that came out of my whole book and clearly my whole life is that piece of vulnerability and how being vulnerable gives you the absolute opportunity to show the world your true strengths. And so in sharing and mentoring and coaching kids and other people, it's sharing with them those vulnerabilities and those moments where you feel really icky and sticky, and being able to actually embrace that and take a breath and figure out what to do next. That's what living is all about, and that's what I have found to be the most remarkable piece of my life. Looking back on everything, looking back on all my stories, is that there's always been this piece of exposing my deepest vulnerabilities and in turn also exposing my biggest strengths.
And there was a time, and I'm, probably maybe 20, 30 years ago that our society would look negatively on people who opened themselves up and became vulnerable. It was like, you're exposing yourself to more danger, to more hurt. And I remember back in the early 80s, I had been suffering with migraines. I was sent to an insurance doctor for an exam, an independent exam, and I was molested. And I walked out of the office. I looked at my mother-in-law, and she looked at me like, "Is something wrong?" And my first reaction was, "I can't talk about it because, maybe I let it happen, whatever." But that was the first time in my whole life that I just like opened up. I wasn't crying. I was just like matter of fact with her. And from there, I continued to tell that story over and over again. Because if I hadn't, I was afraid what it would do to me, especially because the next morning I was scheduled to be inseminated so I could have my son. And the first thing I said to my husband that night was, "We're canceling tomorrow." And he looked at me, he says, "Oh, no, we're not. We're not going to let something terrible that happened to you change what we want." And I'm so glad that he was supportive and, made me understand that. But I remember people around me got very upset. "Why do you keep talking about this?" I had somebody not too long ago who said, "Karen, that happened 32 years ago. When are you going to give it up?" I said, "Never. It's part of me."
Mhm.
And I survived it. And hopefully I've helped others survive. And that's what I see that you have done as well, is that, whether it was in your writing, your speaking, your coaching, your mentoring, every time you tell somebody a part of your story, it heals not only you,
Mhm.
but others.
Absolutely. And I think that that's sort of how my book was able to be birthed. Is I originally, about 15 years ago, just started writing down stories. And I had absolutely no idea of what I was going to do with them. I just wrote them. I didn't write them in any sort of order. I didn't write them to be read. I At that point, they were probably more like a journal entry, and I just kept doing it and writing down all these stories. And then all of a sudden, I had 20 plus stories written down. And it wasn't until um, about 3 years ago, maybe a little over 3 years ago, I said to myself, I really want to do something with this. I really want to get my words out to people. I think that it's important. And so that's when I had to actually go back to all my stories and figure out where they actually fit chronologically in my life, and add things like dialogue and make sure that everything actually made sense. Um, eh, but it was one of the most beautiful experiences I've ever done, because it was the most important thing I think that I could create um, at the time, just because it is a piece of me and a piece of that vulnerability and that strength together, and um, putting it all together into one big story, one big book, allowed me to really look at it as a whole and not just as those individual stories. And it gave me a real sense of completion as to, look where I started, look what this did to me, look what this adventure led. And to really be able to, I think everybody deserves to write a conclusion statement on their life, and I think a lot would come from it. A lot of what I really enjoy talking about in terms of the things that I've learned came out of that reflection piece of just editing my manuscript over and over again. And it's so funny, because I really didn't let myself think about my book being in the world. I didn't think about other people reading it that much. I didn't let myself, and I think ultimately because I was worried that I would back out, because it is it's a very, I mean, talk about a vulnerable experience.
Well, there's something about sharing our secret, okay, whether it's writing the journal or the book and telling people about it and then feeling, oh, wow, what if I don't do anything with it? And then there's the other part that works for me. If I let it out to the world, I make sure I do it. Okay. Um, and there's no right or wrong way. And so I hope our listeners understand that, sometimes it's just too hurtful to bring up something from our past. Um, and, I've seen that amongst my own family,
Mhm,
um, and many of the people who we've had on this podcast. But what I think is important is we have to stop judging people. So, my next question to you, a lot of times we see somebody in a wheelchair, and our first reaction is to divert our eyes, because we don't want people to think we're staring at them.
mhm,
Or if we have a little child with us who maybe runs up to the person in the chair and says, "Hey, what happened to you?" As a mother, you say, "Shh,
mhm,
leave that lady alone." But the reality of it is, we have to let those little kids ask those questions
mhm,
because it's new to them.
mhm,
They need to recognize it. And as adults, we have to stop averting our eyes because that is a living human person, whether they're sitting or standing.
mhm,
So I'm sure you ran into this during your journey.
mhm.
Um, how do you react?
Well, first I have to say that I can't speak for everybody that's in a
Sure.
wheelchair. Everybody has their own opinions and feelings about themselves. Um, but I think it's really important for me that people do recognize that I have a wheelchair. It's not something to ignore because it's just as much a part of me as it isn't. And that's something that I actually, at the back of my book, the very first thing it says is her her chair does, and then not is crossed out, define her, because as much as my wheelchair does define me, it also just as much does not define me.
Right.
But to try to, like you said, avert your eyes, that doesn't do anything. It is, it's I'm not dumb. It's there. I know it's there, and I know that it's different. And so um I've worked with children pretty much all of my adult life and all of my paraplegic life, and children are great because they say exactly what people are thinking. And
Right.
so I've been able to learn through them what others are thinking. And I've been told by little kids, like, you have really ugly legs. What's wrong with them? And why are you sitting? Why do you have a stroller? Can I push you? All these different things. And I think it would be really silly for someone in a wheelchair to not appreciate the innocence behind a child's questions. And I think that in turn, it gives you the opportunity for a lesson in terms of, this is something that I need to get around, and I'm really thankful for it because otherwise I wouldn't be able to get around. And it makes me different, and it makes my life a little bit different. Um, but it doesn't change who I am. And I think that just little bits like that go a long way.
Absolutely.
I think talking with adults is harder because there are always preconceived notions. I definitely empathize with adults in the sense that a lot of times I will hear people say, "Oh, I knew somebody that broke their leg and was in a wheelchair once," and that doesn't help. But I understand their intention, and their intention is to connect with me, and that's their only link to knowing a wheelchair, and I get that. But I think probably the most profound thing is having my own children now. I have an 8-year-old and a 3-year-old, and sort of watching my life from their eyes. And because for them, they know that it's not normal that their mom is in a wheelchair, but it's also the only thing that they know. And so it's just this very interesting dynamic all the way around. But that alone, just me having a wheelchair and having a disability has taught them a lot in terms of just their own lessons, their own empathies, how to interact with the world. And it's been really wonderful so far.
Well, and I'm glad I asked you that question because I've had a couple of people on that brought it up on their own. In fact, one gentleman has been a movie director for a very, very long time, had an accident, and like within seconds, his life became, he was paralyzed from the waist down. And he said, you know what? I say the same thing like you did about the chair. Okay. Chair doesn't define me. You may define me in the chair, and that's okay. Okay. But I'm more than my wheelchair.
Mhm.
And I never would have expected any differently. And the strange part was when I interviewed him, I did not even know about his accident. I knew everything else about him. And I was so glad that that's how I learned about it,
Mhm.
because, this was a man that I just totally adored everything about him and still do. And he got me to open my eyes a little differently as well,
Sure.
because it's the environment and culture that we grow up in. And sometimes it's sad that we get the wrong notion. But when people like yourself come out and say, it's okay. I know you may be uncomfortable, but it's sort of my job a little bit to make you less afraid and more comfortable. And God bless your kids for understanding. And how wonderful that you live a full life
Mhm.
despite this horrible accident that you were in.
Absolutely.
So give us the name of the book, first of all.
Yes, it's called When I Grow Up, I Want to Be a Chair.
Oh, I love that. I didn't even see that in the notes. I got to go back, read all the notes again. When I grow up, I want to be a chair. How wonderful. And how can we find it?
The number one place is to find it on Amazon. It's available by paperback, Kindle, and if you're part of Kindle Unlimited, you can borrow it for free.
Wonderful. And how can our listeners reach you if they want to, talk to you a little bit more or get some more information?
Absolutely. My website is my full name, ryanrayharbuck.com. I have a link to message me. I have links to other interviews I've done or pieces I've written. So,
Well, that is absolutely wonderful. Well, I want to thank you for being with us, Ryan. It
yeah,
was extraordinary. And I hope that I didn't ask anything that was too intimate that you didn't want to answer at all. But
it was great here, and thank you.
thank you very much. And have a great day. Okay.
Yeah, you too.
Okay. Bye bye now.